Hi, I'm Chef Kelly York, and this is Therapeutic Cuisine. Today we're going to talk about gluten-free diet. 20 million people in the U.S. have gluten intolerance. 3 million of those have celiac sprue. And of those 3 million, only 1 know that they have it. What is the difference? If you have celiac sprue, it means that you have an autoimmune disease. And when you have an autoimmune disease, your body is kind of fighting itself internally. Today we're going to cook a breakfast pizza biscuit. When you try to develop a pizza dough, you're never going to get that crusty, crispy, chewy pizza crust that we all know and love. It's going to turn out more like a biscuit. So therefore, we developed a breakfast biscuit. This is going to be very satisfying for those of you that are eating gluten-free, and it can be eaten for breakfast cold or hot. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is make the dough. We're going to take some buckwheat flour, which is a gluten-free flour, and mix it with some white rice flour, which is another gluten-free flour, and now coconut flour. Coconut flour is going to absorb a lot of liquid and tighten up the dough. And for some extra protein and flavor, we're adding almond meal, and then finally some quinoa flour. It's very high in protein, also of course gluten-free. That we're going to set aside for a second. We're going to bloom our yeast. Now this is an active dry yeast, and the difference is that when you have an active dry yeast, you do need to bloom it before you put it into the dough. If it's a rapid rise yeast, you can add it right to the dough and just add your hot warm liquids and move right on. So we're going to put that in some hot liquid. Now when the yeast is in the lukewarm water, it's going to become active, and it will look like the yeast is getting a little foamy and bubbling up. That means that it's live. About half of the yeast in the store today are actually not very active. So it's really good when you have an active dry yeast. You can determine that your yeast is good and powerful when you bloom it. So I'm going to give that a little stir, and then after it starts blooming, I'm going to add some flaxseed. The flaxseed is very nutritious, has a lot of omega-3s. It's also going to help that yeast grow on it, and a little salt. And it also acts like an egg in a gluten-free recipe. So we're going to take that yeast and we're going to mix it, the wet into the dry, and mix our dough up. It's going to be wet at first, but that coconut flour starts to absorb the water and it'll get a lot tighter as you mix. Once this is mixed up, we're going to set it aside and let it sit for 10 to 15 minutes. Again, just to give the yeast a chance to do its thing. So that's all mixed up. We're going to set this aside, cover it with a piece of plastic wrap, and give it about 10 to 15 minutes. Okay, now at this point our dough has risen, and you can actually stop here and put the dough in the refrigerator for up to 3 days if you don't want to bake it yet. But I'm going to bake it, so we're going to put it in the pan, which we're going to spray with some olive oil, and then we'll wet our hands and spread and pat this into the pan. The dough is a little loose, very biscuit-like. And we're going to stick this in the oven and bake it at 400 for about 8 to 10 minutes untopped. You want to give your dough a little head start on the bake. If we didn't do that, your dough would be pretty raw by the time your topping is cooked. So this will go for 8 to 10 minutes, and we'll be right back. Okay, my crust is pre-baked now, and you need to, again, pre-bake that a little bit so that when you put the toppings on, your crust is baked enough and it's not going to be a little doughy or raw underneath. We're going to make a Denver type topping today, but you can do a countless number of creative mixtures, like maybe smoked salmon and cream cheese with capers and red onions, or maybe corned beef hash and cream gravy and hot sriracha sauce. We're going to start out by putting an egg layer on our pizza today. We're going to use about 6 eggs, and the pie is in a 9 by 13 pan today, So we're not going to have any problems with the edges. If you're using a pizza pan, you want to make sure that it has some edges because we're going to pour these eggs right into the pan. We're not going to scramble them first. They're going to cook right on top and you're going to have a nice, luscious, soft egg layer on top of your pizza. So we'll go ahead and pour that on as evenly as possible. Just let it sit right on the crust. Next will come our toppings. We're going to use some low-fat cheddar cheese. I like to use the sharp variety, but I know there are people out there that like a nice mild Colby. Doesn't matter. You want to get a grass-fed cheese, a cheese that is made from cows that were to pasture. It's higher in omega-3s. It also doesn't have the hormones. Just a lot healthier all around. It also tastes better. We're going to put some ham on that, some diced ham. Try to get a nitrate-free ham. Even a fresh ham will be good. Next, we're going to add some vegetables. The classic Denver is green peppers. I'm going to add some black beans as well. We want to add extra fiber. Magnesium is good in the black beans. You're going to love these colors on here. We're going to add some tomatoes. And you can chop them and seed them if you'd like, or just leave the seeds in. And finally, our black beans. They'll get nice and lodged into that egg as it cooks. And some scallions. And that's it for our toppings. Actually, I like to add a little kick. So we're going to put some red pepper flakes on there. Doesn't really need salt and pepper. You got plenty of sodium usually in the ham. So there you have it, a gluten-free breakfast pizza biscuit. I'm going to go and put this in the oven for another 10 to 15 minutes and get started on making our next recipe, which will be a gluten-free plum coffee cake. Okay, now I'm going to make a purple plum coffee cake that is gluten-free. So we're going to start out by making the streusel topping first. We're going to use a little whole grain brown rice. It's very important because it contains the hull, which is the outside coating of the grain, the starch inside, and the germ. If you have polished rice, it's going to only have the starch, so you're not going to get that fiber count. The oats that we put into this topping can either be oat flour or rolled oats. I'm going to use rolled oats because I like to see my grains. And then some brown sugar. You can also use coconut sugar. Some almonds, and we're using sliced today. Some nutmeg for flavor. And then we're going to cut in some butter. You can use a pastry blender, or you can use 2 knives, or you can use your hands. I'm just going to start cutting that in. And when that's nice and crumbly, we're going to set it aside, and that's all you need to do to make a streusel topping. I'm going to get my hands in it for time. Nice and crumbly. This will go on the top after we make the dough. Okay, so that is nice and crumbly. So now we will make a batter. I have pre-greased the pan, and you can use a spring-form pan or any cake pan. And we're going to make a batter. We're going to add a little sugar to the bowl, some white rice flour, some potato flour. Now these are all good gluten-free flours, but you do want to make sure, like especially with the oat flours, that it's a oat flour that hasn't been contaminated by being made in a plant that has gluten flours such as wheat, rye, and barley. We're going to continue with adding xanthan gum. Xanthan gum is a thickener, and it's used to help the dough stretch when you're making a gluten-free recipe. You can also use guar gum. I actually prefer the guar gum. The xanthan gum is actually made by an offshoot of bacteria. The guar gum is actually made from a bean. We're also going to add some baking powder. Because we don't have a gluten flour in this recipe, there's no gluten to stretch when the dough to make a structure. So the baking powder is going to be a leavener in this recipe. It activates the baking powder that creates CO2 bubbles and will make the dough lift. You also need that to happen soon enough so that as it's baking, the structure is set and cooked into a light batter. So that's what we put in so far. We're going to now add some eggs and that almond milk. And I like to use an almond milk that is unsweetened. And this one has a little vanilla in it. And last but not least, we're going to add some almond extract, and that's strictly for flavoring. So the dough gets mixed until it's evenly blended. And we're going to put that in our pre-greased pan and bake it with the plums on top. Now, when it's in season and plums are available fresh, you're going to cut them in half and pit them and lay them down with the cut side down around your pan like the numbers of a clock. Okay, so that's nice and even. And now we top the coffee cake with our streusel. So you put that on as evenly as you can, and this will bake nice and crumbed-like on the top. Who doesn't love streusel? I pat that down just a little bit. And then finally we're going to add our plums. Since it's not the plum season right now, I'm actually using a dried plum. We pre-plumped them in some boiling water and just let them sit till they get nice and soft and plumpy. And I like to add a little almond extract to the water and sometimes a little lemon rind as they're plumping. If you're using a fresh, you're going to cut them in half and we're going to place them on the coffee cake with the cut side down. Of course, you want to remove the pit as well. Plums are just a beautiful fruit. They are so healthy. They're another superfood, and they're full of fiber and antioxidants. I like to put them around like the numbers on a clock so that when you slice your cake, you're going to have a plum in each slice. You can even add more plums than a dozen. You can dot them all over, as many as you've got. And there's our last plum. Plums get a bad rap. They're a wonderful fruit. They're high in antioxidants and fiber. And if you're like my husband, he eats them every day like a very good, disciplined, healthy eater. We're going to now make another recipe, but first I'm going to get this in the oven, and it's going to cook at 350 degrees for about 30 to 35 minutes. We're going to come back and do another gluten-free recipe, which is a chocolate goldfish cracker. Okay, now we're going to start on making homemade chocolate gluten-free goldfish crackers. Actually, any shape cracker that you want. You want to get a little cookie cutter or an aspic cutter to make your crackers. And this recipe is good for having as a snack on hand for somebody who really wants to avoid that gluten. You know when you go on an airplane flight and they bring down those pretzels and you're just tempted to eat them? Well, this is a good recipe to make at home and be able to pack up. I'm not aware of too many cracker companies that make a gluten-free snack cracker that would be handy for on the run. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to make this with, of course, gluten-free flours. First, we're going to use a rice flour, which is, of course, gluten-free, a whole oat flour, and we're going to put in some cocoa powder. Now, cocoa powder is full of polyphenols and very healthy magnesium, calcium. We add also a little mochico flour. Now, mochico is made from the maki rice grain. It's a very sticky flour or very sticky rice, and it pulls the dough together. We also are going to add some tapioca starch, and that's a very fine flour that will make some softness to the cracker so that it's not so coarse. And now we've added some coconut flour. A lot of people don't look for coconut flour in their grocery stores, and there's a lot of places that you can find it now where maybe a few years ago it was a little more difficult to find, but it's a wonderful flour to cook with. It has a very nutty flavor. It's very high in fiber and it absorbs a lot of moisture. You would need to double the amount of liquids that you would normally use in the recipe. We're also going to add some guar gum, and guar gum is a thickener. It helps the dough stretch. It actually also helps when you bake a dough to give it a little bit more of a chew, and all gluten-free recipes for baked goods are going to either have xanthan gum or probably a guar gum in part of that mix. We are also adding some baking soda. The baking soda, of course, is a leavener, and we need to leaven this dough. We can't use gluten dough, so it's not going to stretch very tall. So we need to add a leavener. Finally, we're going to add some salt. We're going to just mix those dry ingredients a little bit together so that we blend in that cocoa powder. We don't want to have a clumpy dough. The cocoa powder can also, you can sift the dry ingredients into the bowl, but I find that that's just a little bit too much time and too much futziness. Okay, we're going to pour in that almond milk, and almond milk is made by soaking almonds in water and then straining off the liquid so that you get a milky, non-dairy liquid that you can cook with. It's also high in magnesium. It's often flavored with vanilla or chocolate. I particularly like to cook with the vanilla kind and the unsweetened kind. I'm going to add some coconut sugar here, and the coconut sugar is very high in minerals, and it also is said to help keep your glycemic spikes from spiking up so quickly. Coconut sugar is made by the nectar of the coconut palm tree, and there's some controversy now because the sugar is becoming so trendy for its health purposes. We're not growing the trees as much for the coconuts because the coconut tree can't produce both. It can't produce the fruit and the flowers for the nectar. It has to be one or the other. So there are some folks that are getting a little sensitive to what is the biggest priority, the fruit or the nectar for the sugar. Okay, we're going to also add some melted butter. We need a little fat, and that's going to get stirred in. Once this gets tightened up, I'm going to put it in the refrigerator to get it chilled for a little while, and then we're going to roll it out and cut it and start putting it on a cookie sheet to put in the oven and bake. And our last ingredient is a little vanilla. Vanilla always spikes up that chocolate flavor. I know it seems like a misnomer, but the vanilla and the chocolate just work together and make each other taste better. I'm going to mix it up a little bit more to make sure it's all nice and evenly blended. And I'm going to get my hands in there. So I'm going to take this, form it into a ball, and cover it with some plastic wrap and put it in the refrigerator. It needs to be just a little bit tighter before I start cutting it into the shapes of the crackers. Okay, so I've covered this. I'm going to put it in the refrigerator, and I'll be right back to cut our crackers. I'm going to need to roll it out now, so I'm going to take some gluten-free flour and sprinkle it on my board so that cracker dough will not stick. It's also good sometimes to put some on your rolling pin as well. We're going to roll this out for, oh gosh, about 1/8 of an inch of thickness. If it's any thicker, it's going to take your crackers longer to cook. But you can choose what thickness you want. Just watch it in the oven. When it's 1/8 of an inch thick, we're going to take a little cutter. I like to use aspic cutters. If you have a goldfish cutter, that would be excellent. I don't, so I'm going to use a little star cutter. And this is out of an aspic cutting container with all kinds of little shapes. I happen to like the star. So each of these are going to be stamped into the dough, and you're going to put it on a cookie sheet. I've pre-lined this sheet with some parchment. You can also use a silpat. A silpat is a baking mat that is made out of a polymer, and nothing will stick to it. Keep it in your drawer, roll it up with a rubber band, and it stores like a dream. If you don't have one, I really recommend that you get one. We're going to cut out as many of these that you can possibly fit and put them in the oven. The stars are about, 1/4 of an ounce in weight. So about the size of a big goldfish cracker. I'm going to go ahead and continue to stamp these. Again, all kinds of shapes, and get your kids involved in this. It's almost like playing with Play-Doh. And I find that when the kids help cut out these shapes, they're much more apt to eat the snack. Again, this is a gluten-free cracker, and you can take it on the run for a little snack. It's good if you're diabetic. There's not a whole lot of sugar in this, just a little bit. So let's go ahead and continue doing this, and we'll get them ready for the oven, bake them off. When you take them out, they're going to be a little soft at first, but as they cool, they will get crisper. So these are looking pretty festive. This would be great for the 4th of July. You can change any shape for the match the holiday that's coming up. I actually carry an aspic cutter, I'm weird, in my carry-on bag wherever I go. So this thing is about 1,000 years old. And let's pick out a shape here. How about a flower? I also have card shapes. So if you're having a poker night, it might be kind of fun to have different shapes. These you will store at room temperature in a container. Aspic cutters are used to cut aspic, and aspic is when you have the gelatination of your gravy, that protein, that gelatin gets cut into little shapes in classic French cuisine. It's used for decorating Chateaubriand, or sometimes you use it to cut out little custards when you have a soup. It's just something handy to have, and you know, a cookie cutter is a lot bigger, so I always carry them with me. I'm just weird that way. I'm going to do some little hearts. This would be great on Valentine's Day. You could cut these and put them on your dessert plate for a little extra garnish, or just put them out in a bowl. These store in a container. You want to put a top on it so that it's airtight, and they'll store pretty indefinitely. But I never have that problem. They disappear way before we have to worry about how old they are. Okay, so we're just about full on this cookie sheet, so I'm going to wrap this up, put it in the oven at 350 degrees. If you have smaller cut crackers, it's going to take about 5 to 7 minutes, and if they're larger crackers, give it about 10. Okay, we're going to go pop this in the oven, and then we're going to come back and present all of our gluten-free dishes. Okay, all 3 of my gluten-free recipes are now prepared. I've got a gluten-free breakfast biscuit pizza, homemade gluten-free chocolate goldfish crackers, and a plum coffee cake. The plum coffee cake is ready to be cut, and what I like to do is serve it with either some mascarpone cheese or some Greek yogurt dolloped on the top. It cuts real beautifully. It goes wonderful with coffee, and again, it's totally gluten-free, and that means no wheat, barley, or rye. And a little dollop of yogurt, and there we go, ready for coffee. Okay, so 3 gluten-free recipes, which means it is free of wheat, barley, or rye. And as the father of medicine said, let food be thy medicine and let medicine be thy food. I'm Chef Kelly York. This is Therapeutic Cuisine. We'll see you next time.